Today, we're looking at democracy and the voluntary sector. And many people argue that the voluntary sector is absolutely vital for democracy in our country and in many other countries, when many of the checks and balances against a powerful government has been eroded, particularly local government and local governance recently. The checks and balances that exist are vulnerable. And one of those checks and balances that has become increasingly important is the voluntary sector. How do we encourage this? How do we enable this? And how do we prevent it being taken over by the establishment so that the voluntary sector becomes hand in hand with government? Those are really crucial questions. Now, we've got here to help us today, Matt Scott. Now, Matt has, with lecturers at London Met, he started the Community Coalition organisation. He's a part of the London Voluntary Sector Coalition as well, which is an umbrella organisation for voluntary organisations in London. And he's going to go through some of these issues today. So I'm going to hand you over to Matt, who will then talk to you for about 15 minutes with a PowerPoint presentation. Please feel free to type in your questions or your comments so that we can respond to them and hear them. And then when Matt's finished, we will put your questions to Matt. And, excuse me, I have an awful cough. And he will answer them and we will develop a discussion. So Matt, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm going to take you through a few slides now. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour because that's the nature of the topic, which is pretty vast, really. As you can see, democracy and the voluntary sector is a very vibrant picture. I think you've got in front of your screens there, but challenged, I think, by some of the harsher realities in our world. So if we can look at the slide, democracy and the voluntary sector, you'll see some bullet points there. Yes, when I was putting this together, I was thinking about the ultimate importance of this, and for me, both democracy and the voluntary sector is absolutely fundamental to our well-being. You know, how we feel, our health, our autonomy, something about our individuality, and how we're able to take control of our lives. And really, in terms of progressive politics, our future collective development. So it really couldn't be more important. But I do think also that, in particular, the voluntary sector is a bit of a backwater policy-wise, that it very easily gets forgotten. Also, to put down a few markers, I would say that both of these terms are so big as to be in danger of being at times quite meaningless, quite vacuous if we're not careful. They're contested. I've got a quote from someone called Hillary there, which is about person did their research a while ago, and they found 94 definitions of community, which is going some. So not only is there not agreement, but there's a multiplicity of different meanings, and I think there's some positives there, a vibrancy of debate, but also I put there about it being ideologically freighted, and I think that's really important to recognise the power of ideology, of politics, and how people spin things as well. So we have to be on our guard for that. I suppose also what I like about this topic is it allows us to move very broadly across social policy. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about how it enables us to think about the public good, and really navigate across this idea of the state or government, perhaps, the market and the private sector. Sometimes into that mix is thrown the family and civil society. Civil society basically being non-state, non-private sector actors, community groups in the main. And I do think what we see, particularly at the grassroots of voluntary action, is a lot of spontaneity of people doing things because that's what they want to do. That's something that motivates and drives them. Perhaps in a more professional setting, when they're sitting behind desks or computers, they're much more tied to structure. But certainly at the grassroots, it's very much about a kind of a creative human expression of goodwill. And also of the centrality of values and principles, where people do things for reasons of not just the common good, but social solidarity, collective action, equality, and so on. So those are very important. If we move to the next slide, briefly, I'll just show you a diagram that we have in front of us in the next slide, which is of a diamond shape, which again is just for you to think about in terms of conceptually, which is about households and families. Perhaps at the top, we know that some politicians make great play out of hardworking families, for example. Likewise, the state, contested term, but not quite interchangeable with government, but certainly local agencies, public sector, the market, and the not-for-profit sector, if we like. So this is a slide that we use at London Met University in that way, just to kind of try and flesh out what we mean by this social society sphere. But I'd kind of say that a lot in neoliberalism, the era that we currently live in, I suppose, following Thatcher and Reagan, that a lot of the tram lines of debate seem to go backwards and forwards with the state and the market. People like Giddens and so on have talked about the market state. We might see in the City of London revolving doors between former ministers who then go on to have well-paid roles as directors of various blue chip companies and so on. So certainly the state and the market are preeminent, but in order to get a more wholesome local vision, it needs to encompass not just individuals and families, but the collective action of a not-for-profit sector, a voluntary sector. And again, another picture for you to look at the next slide that I've got there for you, just going back one, is a three-legged stool. And the quote that I think you're looking at the moment is part of a debate that they had in the House of Lords. And the House of Lords tends to talk about the sector a lot more than the House of Commons, which is quite perplexing in some ways, given that David Cameron, when he was elected in the coalition government 2010, talked about three priorities: the war in Afghanistan, paying off the debt, and then thirdly, the big society. But it's amazing how the big society, which obviously references community action, moves on and off the agenda in a way. But Nat Way from McKinsey was David Cameron's civil society, big society advisor for a couple of years. And he was appointed at a fairly young age, about 30, to be Lord Way. And this was his maiden speech that you're looking at there, which I'm referencing. And Reverend Tim Stevens, in response, was saying, well, actually, if we're serious about big society, then we need to envisage this idea of a three-legged stool, and it kind of touches those bases, the state, the market, civil society. The problem being that civil society, i.e., community groups, is a very underdeveloped area in the sense that it doesn't enjoy the kudos and the money and the power that other parts of society do. So if we're talking about this model, then we need to appreciate that these things are not to scale, that they're radically different and under-resourced. And again, to kind of expand on that, the next slide that I've got, I just wanted to try and, in the time that I've got, define my terms. I need to say that I'm talking very much from a London English perspective. I have worked in the Midlands and the Northeast, but I do feel that Ireland, North and South, and Scotland are very different in terms of how they do things, Wales to some extent. The amazing thing about this country, the UK, is that we've got about 1 million voluntary community sector organisations. I'll give you some figures for that a bit further on. But if we think about a population of 65 million, and to look at the 900,000 to about 1 million civil society organisations, that's an incredible figure. And that's specific to this country. Other countries obviously have groups of people, community groups, but every country's quite different in terms of their culture and their history. Likewise, in terms of the voluntary sector, it's very much tied to the development of the state, of government. The welfare state, particularly from perhaps the 1970s, 80s, and very much under Tony Blair, saw a proliferation of voluntary organisations because they were funded. George Osborne, in his recent comprehensive spending review and budget, looking to cut back the amount spent on public services and welfare, is creating what I believe Richard Nozick talked about, a night watchman state, where the state doesn't pay for so much, and that's very much part of the big society vision. A crucial thing that I want to try and get across is that the voluntary sector, I've said it's contested, people don't agree about quite what it is to kind of get in mind this idea of a formal professional sector and a much more volunteer-led informal sector. And quite a lot of the attention goes on the formal, the big brands and the names of the charities, but actually most of the sector is basically working in somebody's front room or place of worship. And likewise, groups might have a specialist focus, could be around disability or housing, or they might be generic, so they might try and be enabling groups in a much more overarching and holistic way. I think the other confusing thing about the sector is that it keeps on getting renamed by people in power. So the sector was fairly comfortable with the idea of being the voluntary and community sector in the 1980s, perhaps early 1990s. New government, Tony Blair and the Third Way, rebranded the sector. They set up a third sector unit, and they started calling this our voluntary sector the third sector. And it was this idea of the sector being much more in partnership with the delivery of services, that kind of thing. Fast forward 2010, new terminology again, and you couldn't really imagine the public sector or the private sector getting rebranded by other people, but our sector, again, I speak as a voluntary sector community worker, was rebranded into civil society organisations. Civil society organisations being outside the market and the state sector. Different terminology which exists for community groups and voluntary organisations. Charities being perhaps the most well-known and perhaps the most infamous at the moment, given some of the hostile debates that I'll talk about. Social enterprises, I know GlobalNet 21's done a lot of work with those. A term kind of came into being in the mid-90s, and there's probably about 60,000 social enterprises around the country at the moment. Cooperatives, more old style, and basically community groups that don't necessarily have the terms of reference, but are perhaps the most abundant form of voluntary sector organisation.
You know, in this country, I think government looks upon the voluntary sector as an arm for delivering government services. Therefore, they're always looking at ways of controlling that sector and preventing its autonomy. Whereas many in the third sector, the civil society sector, the voluntary sector, want much more autonomy to do the things that they are trying to do to carry on their mission. And it seems to me, I'm really taking over from that until he gets back. It seems to me that the voluntary sector has developed in two ways. One is that we've seen the growth of the voluntary sector that emerged in the 1960s, like the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace and Amnesty, that have grown in size tremendously. And as they've grown in size, they've almost become to reflect the government that they negotiate with. They spend so much of their time trying to negotiate with ministers and civil servants and government that they tend to reflect that a lot more than they reflect their members. I belong to a voluntary organization called the United Nations Association, and it's going that way now, partly because its membership is in decline. So they're trying to become a think tank. They're trying to become a self-perpetuating elite in a way. And they're calling themselves the third sector. Now, many of the organizations that grew up in the 60s have developed that way. But in the 1990s and early years of this millennium, many community associations have emerged which are not like that. One book called Blessed Unrest by a guy called Hawkins has argued that this is the biggest revolution in the world because it consists of community groups who all want to do something. They maybe want to change the world, they want to save the planet, they want to help people who are disabled, they want to raise funds for a particular issue, but the numbers are in millions throughout the world. And as Matt said, there's already 1 million in this country already. Now, it's that new voluntary sector that are facing real problems when it comes to funding and survival and sustainability. And it's that one which, to some extent, we've got to find ways of trying to strengthen and enhance. The voluntary sector is finding that difficult because government wants a voluntary sector that would just do charitable things and provide services, and they don't want a voluntary sector who will campaign, for example, politically, but many groups want to do that. And so they're a combination of having a mission to change things as well as, you know, having a mission to be political.
You'll see a lot of people tend to be confused between the voluntary and community sector, which is tends to be used a great deal. So community sector, which is by far the majority of groups, tend to be much more, as I say, spontaneous, informal, participative, tends to have less money, volunteer-led, and so on. And the voluntary sector, more specifically charities, quite often, possibly social enterprises, these tend to be a bit more professionalized, paid workers, and so on. So moving ahead, just to note that kind of distinction there, that's very important. And you'll see for the next slide a picture of an iceberg. It's one I like to use because it breaks up the text. But really, when we talk about the voluntary sector or the third sector or what have you, the important thing I want to get across is that most of it we never really see because it's below the surface. It's people busily getting on with doing informal collective acts of goodwill. So that is a really fundamental contextual point that's there, and it's borne out by the next slide, which I'm also sharing with you, which is that government acknowledges what I'm saying there, which is that over 90%, I would say at least, of the sector is made up of community groups. So that's the informality, and the critical point here, which is that government in the New Labour era saw those as the backbone and building blocks of a democratic society. And we might like to think, why would they think that? Really, I think it's the spontaneity, the collective action that those groups are taking, rather than just a cross on the box every 5 years or so. The next slide again is just a point of substantiation. But one of the things that I think defines the sector is a very big gap between the small community groups and the absolute giants that exist there. I'm not just talking about the ActionAids or Oxfams, but some of the very large charity brands that are there, possibly the Age Concerns or the Citizens Advice Bureaus or so on. And in the New Labour era, a lot of money went into the sector. It pretty much doubled in size. But this key thing that the Treasury report is picking up is that whilst the sector was expanding, the gap between small and medium-sized charities got larger, i.e. a few rich organisations got very rich. So we know the kind of 1% logic that has followed us in recent years. But there is a kind of a structural inequality within the sector whereby a kind of a much bigger divide between small, unfunded community groups with pretty much no money and some of the larger groups has got there. And I think that's one of my big concerns that I have for the sector, is a kind of a lack of sharing some of the resources within it. Moving on to the next slide quickly, I wanted to give you some numbers just in terms of defining what we're talking about. I mentioned the million organisations. What I'm referencing there is the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, NCVO Almanac, and they do a study every year of community groups and how many there are of them, and they estimate on quite a conservative basis, so hence I'm comfortable in saying there's 1 million groups, which earlier studies have shown there to be. They've got no real understanding of the number of informal community groups because there's no register. We know that there are charities, so hence I'm able to give that 2015 figure of 160,000 because the Charities Commission has a register, but community groups is really guesswork. I suspect there's many more than that. Some of the trends, NCVO charge quite a lot of money to get the almanac, so I don't always buy my annual copy. But you can see that it's a heavily feminized sector, a lot of volunteering that goes on there, and a great difference where most charities, let alone any other organisation, actually have less than £10,000. So moving on quickly to the next slide. I know through some of the previous chats that we had before online about governance and, you know, what are the rules and regs for the sector? Well, given most of it is informal, there isn't a great deal of legal beyond the laws of the land in a general sense instruction. But I do reference something for people that are interested, a handbook called Voluntary, not Amateur, which talks in much more detail about kind of good practice that's there. Charitable law is very much in the headlights of media attention at the moment, and typically with larger voluntary organisations there'll be trustees, you know, there may be directors, and they need to have all the professional processes in place that employ staff and deliver contracts. Just noting the time that we're in at the moment, Kids Company, for example, in Peckham, people probably will have come across Camilla Batman Gellich, and who was given millions of pounds by politicians, particularly David Cameron, and then the governance came to be a bit of an issue, so the group was actually closed down. So the one of the issues was about where the sector's up to in terms of is it being properly managed, and government is now moving towards a charities bill. They're looking at gagging clauses so that charities don't criticise funders, and in particular do not criticise government. And this is a very difficult time for the voluntary sector. And one of the organisations that's been leading the charge against charities is the Institute of Economic Affairs, who have published some fairly vitriolic reports. 2012 there was one called Sock Puppets, which I'd invite you to look at, but likewise the True and Fair Foundation has again been looking at charities and been fairly disparaging about them. My take on it, for what it's worth, is that yes, there is good and bad practice out there, but actually I don't see the charities on the whole being particularly outspoken about government policy. Personally, I wish they were much more. So I see it as rather a toxic debate. But moving on to the next slide, I think you'll recognise some people here. I just wanted to draw attention to this phrase, "we're all in it together," which is being used increasingly in political debate. It hasn't gone away as a kind of a strapline, and it really invites us to think critically about, does it feel like that in our neck of the woods? Is this how we experience people and the way society is organised as in fact being? You know, we might look at the Panama Papers, for example, and escalating inequality. But moving forward to the next slide, I'm not just making a glib comment. This is actually embedded into government documents. So the Cabinet Office, an absolutely critical department, is beginning to put it in the mix in terms of its comms. I'm going to say a little bit about big society in the brief time that I have, but there's a defining reorganisation of the social contract, if you like, between the rights of citizens and their responsibility. And a lot of volunteer work is being exhorted by government, largely because it's cheap, and you know, services are being cut left, right and centre. We might know of local libraries that are run by volunteers that would have been cut, and so on. So this is the kind of mood music of our times. And moving forward again, another slide, I wanted to very quickly just run through the idea of democracy. Can't really do such a rich topic justice, but I do think that we need to try and be as precise as we can about what kind of democracy are we talking about. John Keene's kind of threefold model, I think, is an interesting one. We live in a representative democracy. We get the politicians based on votes, and they run the country on our behalf. Assembly models, whether Greece or earlier times, for example, much more engaged debate, whereby the citizens as much as possible took as much power and control as they were able to. And increasingly, perhaps in a web-enabled age, monetary democracy, where pressure groups become increasingly powerful. We look at change.org, for example, they have quite a lot of sway. They kind of monitor and can be influential. R.H. Tawney, a kind of between the wars socialist,
coined this phrase about democracy as an unstable compound, in the sense of how far do we want to go, how much democracy and say do we want to have, not just in terms of the right to vote, but maybe the right to run our economy and divvy up the wealth in that way. Also, this idea of post-democracy has been coined, a feeling that we've kind of moved away from it, that we're in a kind of a malaise. Or Christian Felber, who has done a lot of work on this, says that actually we haven't really achieved what democracy should be. It's all to come. I think that actually where we are, I'm skipping ahead a bit, but the modern, we've moved really to a very flexible, liquid, hybrid era, where things move much more quickly, and we're beginning to only slowly orient ourselves to the power of technology that's actually out there. New slide on big society. I've just wanted to sort of give you a few pointers on big society, given that it obviously references a lot of our thoughts. I know that the coalition and Conservatives tend not to use the phrase, but it has kind of guided their thoughts still very much to this current time. If you can get hold of it, I'd invite you to look at the 2009 Conservative Party Green Paper, because it was very much a positive steer on the voluntary sector. And likewise, the think tank Res Publica, Philip Blond, who runs that, coined the idea of the Red Tory, whereby the Conservative Party, he was arguing, were the true social progressives. In effect, what big society has become is two large programs: a community organizer program based on the kind of Alinsky Obama championed model, and the National Citizen Service around holidays for young people to do kind of community work. That's basically what the government is doing, and cut back on a lot of other programs. And likewise, if we're going to understand big society, we have to see it as the corollary being a small state. Big society because actually the country can't afford the level of public services and spending, so the politicians tell us. So the vision, and Osborne is following this through, is for a much smaller run state as a result. A lot of criticism about this, which people will probably be aware of. Is it a con? Which is what Pete Alcock asked the question of. He's director of the Third Sector Research Centre, or was until recently. Is it a cover for cuts? Is this window dressing? And I think for me the most culpable thing was the complete lack of a plan, the kind of hands-off approach of really just letting things take shape without any kind of funding or support. And I think it's important to realise that big society is not a neutral term. It comes with its own ideology. It is a form of hegemony. It is a form of trying to persuade us to accept a certain state of affairs. So, last few slides. These are the questions I'd like us to think about. You know, big society, democracy, what voluntary sector is there to do. These are all kind of ideas, and we can kind of take them on board and challenge them, or we can basically absorb them and perhaps become influenced by them in a more passive way. The work of Paulo Freire, I think, as a Brazilian educator, is absolutely central to all of this. And he really exhorts us to, through dialogue, embrace critical thinking, to not be naive and expect that those in power will necessarily deliver the best outcomes for us. The next slide kind of likewise covers this, which is a quote which I really enjoy from Margaret Ledwith, which is about how power holders shape what we think is possible, and then moving forward to the De Philippus Fischer-Schrag definition that you're now looking at. Wonderful short book, which I think addresses a central dilemma, which is the danger of the voluntary sector activity is that it lets government off the hook if things can be provided on the cheap, and there's a danger that we're all impoverished by a lack of resource on the things that matter. So what they were putting forward in the end of their book is really that community, in order to play a much fuller role, needs to be much more in the centre of debate. And I said at the beginning about how marginal the voluntary sector is in terms of government policy. But it also, we can't just stay at the level of community groups, that there has to be connections with other wider social movements, with fellow travellers, perhaps in the university sector, the private sector, forms of government agency, and so on. We can't be naive about that, so I think ideas of conflict and power are absolutely critical. We can't assume, in fact, that we are all in it together. And all of this needs a lot of critical analysis, but actually, ultimately, this is how history is made. So I think that's a fundamental and important thing. Just moving on a couple of slides, if we may. There are limits to this idea of community resilience, and that's what we're really ultimately being asked to believe in, is community will help us through a difficult period. So the next slide, I've just listed a final set of points there. I do think that investment in the ecosystem or infrastructure is required, that these things, although volunteers do things for nothing, it does need a lot of support if it's not going to be completely exploitative. Very small grants can do a great deal. They can act as a kind of a seed corn. And likewise, sensitive youth and community work is absolutely key. These don't need to be reinvented. They're absolutely a very long tradition standing there. And all of that can be helped along in terms of making sure that people aren't isolated, but that there are networks and that coalitions can be formed. Community is, as I say, a contradictory thing. It can be a zone of government intervention where government just moves in and does what it wants. There's a set of quotes that I put at the end, which you're welcome to look at. Community can also be a kind of a countervailing power. It can be, if we look at, say, for example, the American Civil Rights Movement or the Occupy movement, these have had very strong roots in local communities that have kind of challenged centralized power. I think it's important to not use old models, but try and be more sophisticated in our thought of how we vision community. So whether it's an ecosystem or a network or a set of assets, I think is absolutely key. And likewise, government increasingly sees community as just another social market. We have a social market for health, for housing, for any number of different public sector areas. But the danger is, I think, that if we take a market view that individualizes people as voters and consumers, that have their behavior modified or nudged, that we're missing out on a kind of an important human collective need there. Hazel Blears, when she was communities and local government secretary, talked of community as an ungoverned space, and she was quite fearful in terms of the war of terror that this needed to be looked at. So community can just as easily have a kind of quite a dark side to it. It is a place, it is an identity, it's an affiliation, but ultimately I'd like to leave you with community as a form of democratic practice and a way in which democracy becomes a much more exciting and live proposition. So thanks very much everyone for that, and I'll sign off there.
Claire says she works in the voluntary sector in Scotland, and there is a huge tension there in delivering services in partnership with the local authority, whilst retaining their independence, which matters must be a problem that most volunteer groups are finding. How do you actually work with the state and at the same time maintain your independence?
No, absolutely. I mean, I was a founding member of something called the National Coalition of Independent Action, NCIA, and if you look at their website, you'll see lots of reports of precisely that issue. And I do think that there's a huge issue of government clamping down on the independent sector's right to speak truth to power, and that's a massive problem. But I think even worse than that is the fact that many charities have allowed themselves to in effect self-censor, and the general small p and large p political awareness, the ability to critically analyse and take action, has been lost actually. And so I do think there's always been a tension between charities and voluntary groups that have wanted to be advocates and to campaign, and local councils. I'm sure many of us have all had our stories to tell about fairly bruising encounters, but that to some extent is par for the course. But I do think what's worrying and more insidious is the way that the sector is being leaned on and is not fighting back.
Okay, let me know if you can't hear me anytime and I forgot to unmute my microphone. I just want to prevent my cough getting to you. So if you can help me out here, I'd be really, really grateful. So shout at me in text. Lisa says that the whole question of the voluntary sector has got mixed up with the European debate, and that the Leave campaign is saying, that if you take powers back from Europe, then that means the voluntary sector is going to be more likely protected, and it's a shame that's in the debate. But let's leave that as a comment, because I don't want to get into the Europe thing here. Claire, though, says, Matt, that the imbalance of power is a real issue. Pure procurement of services means a triangle partnership is never equal. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that's true. I think there was one thing I used to say doing regeneration partnership, which is that you can't be equal partners without equal resources. And most community groups, well, almost everyone, but by definition, lacks that equality of power. So I think we kind of move between fairly pessimistic ideas of power as one based on conflict to more kind of plural ideas where we can share power, but it's not always going to be a level playing field. I think that the words that you're using around kind of commissioning and procurement are a particular problem, which is that this kind of marketized model of divvying out money that could be much more simply guided through by more informal grant making is now part of what many of us live with. But commissioning and procurement tends to mean that they go to prime contractors, i.e. the very, very big beasts that are out there, which means the voluntary sector, even the larger groups, have got not a chance of actually accessing this money. So Lord Freud of the New Labour era is partly responsible for that particular kind of model. But the commissioning procurement thing, at the end of the day, I think really does massively disadvantage the voluntary sector, because it puts them in a sphere of competitive tendering and a process that is stacked against them. I think the way of overcoming that is for groups to work in coalitions and consortiums, and to insist that they get a certain percentage of all those funds, if that's going to be at all possible. But no, I think commissioning is fraught with a lot of contradictions, and ultimately shortchanges society because it doesn't get to where it needs to go.
Yeah, John actually puts an interesting view. He says he's been very positive and optimistic. A lot of people are saying there's no funding, there's conflict, government tries to want to have control. But John is saying that he's established a number of third sector groups, and these have worked and these have worked with progressive local authorities who funded them and delivered duly informed services. So he's saying if you find the right sort of authority and you create the right sort of relationship, it can be positive and it can work. Is it, Matt, about relationships as well? People need to have the right relationship with, for example, local authorities, because if they go into it like a bull in a china shop, they're going to not get the response they want.
Well, I think that's true. I think it is relational, and I think part of the sector's strengths is that it's about human relationships much more than status and structure, perhaps. But I think my problem with that is that what can be given can be taken away, and so a new set of relationships can be overdone in a minute if, for example, a council leadership changes or something happens. So, I mean, it's a bit of a hackneyed expression that it's, all about relationships and trust, but I don't think that's always enough. And I think if you work in town halls that are heavily politicized, and politics is all about conflicts and tensions and so on, it's not the most healthy, and it kind of invites a certain kind of selective attention, whereby certain groups are rewarded and other groups are kind of frozen out. So I agree with that. I think it is about taking perhaps a pragmatic view of influencing, but I certainly wouldn't put all the eggs in that particular basket. I mean Gramsci, who talks a lot about civil society, talks about an optimism of the will but a pessimism of the intellect, and I think that's kind of really important. I'd also, just on that point, invite you to look at Simon Parker, who's chief executive of New Local Government Network, has done a book called Taking Power Back, and he's very optimistic, and I think you have to be, about the opportunities for decentralization and what George Osborne's now doing. But likewise, we're in a world where we're seeing cutbacks on every level. So there are always opportunities, there are always people to work with, absolutely. So that would be my response.
Bell Noor, for example, is written quite a lot on the chat. If you see that, she does a lot of voluntary work, and she says that a lot of volunteers are doing work now that used to be done by paid nurses and by professional staff. And she's worried that the right sort of training and skills are not there. People are not given the context, the background, the training that they need. And that actually creates a sort of battlefield of conflict.
Absolutely. I think it's very invidious if there are roles where you do need expertise, and it could be matters of life and death, that's being increasingly placed into the hands of volunteers in a country that's sixth or seventh most wealthy in the world. But that is the thrust of government policy, which is that the volunteering has an increasing role to play. So I think if it's about issues of health and social care, then that's a particular kind of concern that exists there. There's also a fallacy, I think, which is that anybody can do community work or anybody can do youth work, and I think that also can de-skill and de-professionalize. When I showed you the figures of the feminization of the sector, something like 70% of workers being women. Well, I think that also goes alongside kind of a patriarchal oppression, whereby the low status of the voluntary sector relative to the higher levels of the private sector and public mirror that. So I think there's a kind of a certain amount of sexism that can also come into tow with that as well.
Yeah, Claire, for example, says earlier on in the discussion when you were talking about, and you had the slide of Cameron on, and we're all in this together. She says, well, we're not really all in this together, are we? That the elites will always be in control. And the UK government is using what she calls neoliberalism or neoliberalism language to justify ideological cuts in services. And there is this view that cuts are ideological and are not necessary. I mean, where do you stand on that, Matt? I mean, are cuts ideological because the government wants to run down the public sector, or are they necessary because of the deficit?
Well, I mean, I think it's my take on the voluntary sector and social policy, is very much my own. So I think that's one thing. I mean, I always reflect on the fact that the modern welfare state in the UK was formed out of the bankruptcy of the Second World War. So when the country was most in debt, it also spent most in creating the modern welfare state. So I do think it is about political will and political priorities, and hence it is specifically ideological. A lot of the mainstream political parties are getting to some extent behind austerity, but these are very kind of fractured and challenged times that we're living in. In terms of the economics that I've studied, I think that doing cuts in a recession has been proven to not be the most effective thing. And if you look at how America handled its bailouts and deficits, it tended to spend much more in infrastructure than this country, and hence its growth is a lot higher. So I do not accept the, in inverted commas, common sense that there is no alternative to austerity. And I do see the voluntary sector as a political football that's being manipulated into trying to fulfill that kind of discourse, really. So that's my view, and I would invite people to look at, for example, the Res Publica stuff and the Jesse Norman MP book on Big Society, because I do think that the sector generally is left of centre, and it's worth playing with some of those ideas from the right as well. But my view is absolutely, I think that it is ideological and unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, Claire, having made a sort of rather pessimistic assessment early, later on is much more optimistic, where she says that she's just come back from India, and she was quite amazed and surprised there about how the NGO sector is challenging the government. But not just that sector, the communities themselves are driving forward change. Is that a sort of model you would want here, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the best practice has always been elsewhere, So I'm particularly inspired by Paulo Freire and his work in Brazil, and my involvement with Community Development Journal, which is an international-based community journal, just shows me how amazing what other countries are doing. So my spiel is very much London, if not England, centric, and the poorer for it. I think that every country is incredibly different, and many countries in the world just don't have the kind of government, the overdevelopment, and the government that we have. So our expectations are much the higher. So I wouldn't necessarily replicate, and it's obviously not possible to do this wholesale India or parts of Brazil, but I do think that there is some fabulous work that we can be inspired by and use.
Julie has actually put a suggestion up to a YouTube which looks at the balance in procurement, but I don't think, Julie, you put a link up, and if you've got one, that would be would be really, really useful. Let's see what other points we've got up. Isabella says pulling resources is one thing, resourcefulness is another. We don't all have the same skills, some can be learned. I mean, to what extent is resilience about looking at the assets? I suppose this is Cormac Russell's point, looking at the assets people have got and building on them, realizing that people's skills are different and trying to identify what the right skills are.
Yep, I mean, the ABCD stuff has got some brilliant processes in terms of the active listening and storytelling that goes on, and the kind of stressing of the positive, you know, the assets that we all come with. I think that it's important to see leadership in terms of teamwork, and I think sometimes the focus on skills can be quite reductive in terms of employability, getting someone, you know, into a job, any job, short-term, precarious or whatever. I mean, I think that there's a synergy that happens when people work together that you can't just simply map, but becomes a very real and dynamic experience for those that are part of it. So I'm really interested in the collective action rather than a kind of more dry approach to skills, for example. And I think the wonderful thing about community work is people tend to learn it on the hoof, and you know, with portfolio careers, etc. Then I think that adaptability is key, but it's mediated through a much more social context than perhaps people might get from going to college, going to various kind of night school courses, and so on. So I do think that rather than saying that some people have skills, others don't, is that I try and put it more in the sense that we've got an abundance of opportunities, an abundance of skills that can be harnessed, and we just need the spaces and the opportunities to be more socially engaged and to begin and curate and support that kind of process, really. And that's why perhaps the closing down of community centres and youth centres is such a damaging thing, because all too easily people can become isolated and not given the kind of resources to allow them to really engage on their own terms in their own way. So that would be my take on it.
Lakshmi, who's on here, and she often contributes to our forums and discussions, she says, interestingly, in the end, voluntary organisations can only survive if the government of the day approves of their work. So they're dependent on the government. So her argument, I guess, and the way she puts it there, and I think someone else sort of echoes it, is that you have to have the right sort of government and its attitude to the voluntary sector. Someone says you need a social democratic government. Now, you know, how do you fit in with that argument, Matt? Because some people argue that social democratic governments are some of the most controlling governments there are. I can remember in Sweden, when the social democrats ruled, they wanted to control everything. You couldn't form a trade union unless you belonged to the big approved ones. You couldn't form a voluntary group that was effective unless you belonged to the big approved ones. You know, government and voluntary organisations have a really healthy tension between them, don't they, whatever their colour?
I mean, I think the key words that you said there were about healthy tension, and I think that there is that in a broadly liberal social democratic state. these tensions are played out, and sometimes quite roughly. But I think the danger that we're moving away from is much more of a kind of stripped down libertarian night watchman state, as it's been called, really, whereby there isn't that kind of collective friction. It's much more stripped out. And it's also been quite regulated. My reference to the charities legislation that's being debated at the moment is particularly controlling. So I think there's no simple statement to it. I do think that some of the most effective local governments can be the most controlling, and it's really what I think Kant talked about in terms of the crooked timber of humanity. You know, that we're playing out these kind of issues and these tensions on a day-by-day basis. It's kind of iterative, but that's kind of the point. But I don't necessarily see the government as an enemy at all, in the way that I put some quotes down at the end of the PowerPoint around in and against the state, which is quite interesting of its time, very much a kind of hard sort of Marxist, Trotskyist approach. But I do think we both need strong government, particularly strong local government and strong local communities, that these things aren't mutually exclusive but actually interdependent. So yeah, that's it.
Robert Alexander is talking about a platform he's developed, and Robert, if you'd like to send us more information on that, or in fact you have, I think you put a link up already, I'll send that out with the note we send out later. And you might like to tell us a bit more about that maybe at another time, because it sounds an interesting platform. Joe actually says one of the problems is that because many of the big voluntary organizations are large, people join them not so much nowadays for the mission, but in order to have careers. And that the voluntary sector is now populated with career managers who move from one organization to another in order to get greater responsibilities and promotion. Is that a problem for the voluntary sector, Matt?
I probably think it is. Given my, personal politics and so on, and I think it kind of fits in more with a kind of a gap between the 99% of organisations really who are small and informal, and a very few larger ones, primarily in a London bubble. So that may well be myself, come to think of it, but I do think that there's a few very large voices of the sector that are professionalised. If you look at, for example, the Akivo membership of chief executives of voluntary organisations, perhaps some of the higher echelons of larger organisations, that many of whom have folded now or merged, then they're a world away from grassroots community organisations, and they're much more talking the jargon of service delivery. So yeah, I personally think that's a problem. If we were actually seeing an amazing sea change at a local level that the sector were delivering because of that, then maybe I'd have to think again. But I just think it puts a lot more distance between different wings of the sector, really. So it's a bit like tail wagging the dog. And there is a big issue about leadership in the sector, where I think that the most visible advocates for the sector in terms of commanding access to MPs and policymakers aren't really reflective of the voices at the grassroots, really. And that doesn't help us at a time when we've got big society putting so much pressure on the sector.
Okay, Julie makes quite an interesting point. She apologises for being late, but she says very often it's partly about the narrative, how we articulate the language and how we talk about the organisations that are considered voluntary. Maybe we shouldn't refer to them as charities. People shouldn't call themselves charities. She talks about initiatives like Street Kitchen, which is funded on the basis of a self-help form of solidarity rather than charity. And maybe in this country, particularly in the UK, charity, the word charity, has had a huge history which has affected how we think about community groups. And maybe Julie's saying we need a different narrative for that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the reason why I was talking about the million civil society organisations is because I wanted to kind of reinforce the point that most voluntary groups are not charities, and most charities have got pretty much no money. So there's a massive kind of misconception amongst policymakers and the media that all the voluntary sector equates to some kind of charity. So I think that's an important point. But also, going back to Paulo Freire and the importance of dialogue, I think that it's important that we speak our own genuine words. Narrative is quite often used a lot in the world of charity and so on about selling a message so that policymakers can respond to it, and effective communication. But I think what I'd be really interested in is a kind of Freirean approach to storytelling where people break down a culture of silence by speaking their own truths, and for that shared dialogue to happen at a very informal level. So absolutely about social action at the very much the local level. And it's not just really about the spoken word, but by using digital technology as well. I think there's some really, and arts and music and so on, there's some really inspiring ways by which we can revivify and reimagine voluntary action. So I do very much agree with we need to be communicating and thinking about these things in a different way.
Oh, nearly forgot to turn my mute off. We're coming to the end, so maybe a couple of points. I mean, it's interesting, Matt, what you say about storytelling, and in fact, in about 4 weeks' time, 5 weeks, I can't remember, we have a webinar coming up on storytelling and the value and the importance that can have for social change. So that's an issue we'll be taking up later. And Isabella, and you might want to make this the final point, and we're hoping to do, aren't we, Matt, some events in the future about community change and the digital revolution. And Isabella talks about, making full use of the new technology, the new media, the social networking, but also, as she points out, I've said in the past, that it can often be very fragile. People drop in and they drop out, and there's no sustainability. And again, we're going to do another webinar with David Wilcox that looks at that. How can you have effective social change in this new world of digital technology, which is a real problem we all face? Do you see this as a problem, Matt?
Yes, I mean, sort of know David well, and absolutely, I think the sector has been quite slow on a whole to really use digital technology. I think people's expectations are that we actually communicate in real time, and that people want to not turn up in a meeting in 3 weeks' time or so on, but actually kind of get people and engage with them immediately, and funders are going to want that as well. So I do think, as we were saying previously, that this is a really exciting kind of opportunity. It does need resourcing. This is the key kind of refrain, I think, and it needs to, in a way, transcend tech by actually being about the stories and the lives of people, and for that to be the starting point that new media kind of facilitates. But it's an exciting opportunity. It would be nice to see the private sector really kind of get behind that as well, in terms of playing a more kind of partnered approach to that.
Anyhow, thank you again, Matt, and thank you all for joining us. So we've gone on 8 or 9 minutes over time, so we've had a full hour with you, Matt, even though you disappeared for a cup of tea at some point. Thank you for doing it, and we'll close the webinar down now, and within an hour of it closing, you should all get a link sent to you for the recording of this, and you'll have the recording, and you'll have a recording also of the chat that took place during the webinar, so you see all that. So thank you, and good night for now.